Well, hello everyone. We're going to get started right on the dot just so we can be respectful of everyone's times. Thank you so much for attending. And if you haven't already, please mute yourself as you're coming in, and people who are coming in can trickle in later. But thank you so much for joining us for our session on harvesting strategies from the agriculture sector to enhance climate amplified disaster preparedness. This is the third installment of our virtual National Adaptation Forum for this fall. And to start off with, I'm just going to go over some basic housekeeping rules. So please rename yourself with your name and affiliation, just so we know who is attending this session. And please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and get to know other people who will also be in this session. And for the remainder of the session during presentations, please keep yourself muted just to respect our speakers. And if you have any questions regarding the presentations, please drop them into the Zoom chat as we will be monitoring them and we can pull them out for the live Q&A. And finally, virtual events are way more fun if you engage and participate. So there is no question that is too dumb to ask us. And so please feel free to ask any questions you have whatsoever, and please engage in the breakout activities that we'll have later. Just briefly go over our agenda. So the first part of our session, we'll be going over some presentations by two wonderful speakers, and then we'll do an open Q&A as I mentioned, and we will be doing an interactive breakout activity with the two speakers later on during the session. Now I will begin to introduce our speakers. So our first speaker is Rose, who is a researcher with the Redford Conservancy study on agrivoltaics in Southern California. And our second speaker, Dr. Rachel Schattman, is an assistant professor of sustainable agriculture at the University of Maine, who is leading an interesting program of fellowship for farmers and agriculture advisors who are interested in learning more about climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies. Now we will transition to our first presentation, where Rose will be speaking more about agrivoltaics and how it can be integrated into disaster preparedness. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Daniela. Okay. Good morning in some parts of the United States. Good afternoon in other parts of the United States. My name is Rosa Olivas. I work at Pitzer College in Claremont, California. I am the co-PI for a new agrivoltaic study, the first of its kind in Southern California. And I'm also a Redford Fellow of Applied Research. This is an aerial view of the Robert Redford Conservancy in Claremont. And there's 13 acres that's mostly used for research among the five colleges in the consortium of the Claremont colleges. So begin by acknowledging the land on which we gather in Claremont, and that it occupies and stolen ancestral territory of the Tongva people. As we are very well aware of the changes that come with the climate change, extreme weathers and events in our world right now, in our immediate world, especially for the farming sector, for the agriculture sector, just to simplify what can be faced every summer that we've felt, but maybe not so much because we could be indoors, since if we're not out there actually is aside from the heat stress, there's the stress that can be found on the labor force. And so the labor force is stressed. And then in addition to that, there is an egregious amount of water that's used, especially in Southern California, where it's almost entirely dependent on irrigated water, which is brought in from other parts of the United States. and in turn, or on the flip side of that, when we come to rain events, now we have extreme, sporadic but extreme weather that can cause flooding due to the compaction of the soil. This is all tied in from climate change, from the heat to the winters and back and forth every year. And it's getting worse. So when we talk about the farms, I used to work with the UC Systems Agriculture and Natural Resources Division, and I had the opportunity to work with small scale farms and learn about their costly inputs into their yearly growth production. And so aside from fertilizer that they'd have to purchase that has tripled in cost, there's also the amendments that has to be placed in. And these largely would have to be purchased more frequently due to the deterioration of the soil that comes with, again, the flooding or the heat stress. So there's also electricity bills that farmers would have to face due to just running the operation on their farm. This also ties into pumping water from their agricultural wells, which I will discuss in just a moment, and the impact of that. There's also the loss of labor force, like I was talking about in the previous slide, about the stress that has put on not just the farmers, but the labor that's either seasonal or year round. And that this loss of labor force is seen where they're moving towards other industries if they can. We're also impacted in Southern California, where there's an amazing spike in the development of warehouses that's taken over a lot of agricultural land. So there's also the farmers face the loss of revenue that's due to the low production or the low yield. And also they have found that because of the heat and the way that the plants are not respiring, or there's no efficient respiration in the leaves, that they will face smaller fruit. And both of these, with the low production of smaller fruit, leads to the loss of the revenue due to not being able to sell it to the markets, either the restaurants or the grocery stores. With the impact of climate change on the farm's inputs, there's been so much discussion of what can be done to continuously to combat the heat stress or the extreme events on a yearly basis. So a solution that can be used is the term agrivoltaics, and that's the dual use between the agricultural land and the solar energy, or otherwise known as photovoltaic energy. This is called the nexus of food, energy, and water. So in the pictures, there is a picture up top with farmers planting and growing and harvesting under solar panels. And in the lower right, there is been attempts with cattle and other kinds of grazing, mostly with sheep here in California. There's also been goats, I've heard of pigs, and with chickens. So there's crop production, there's livestock, there's ecosystem services, otherwise like pollinators, land regeneration. Also for nurseries, for green solar, the panels that can be used are translucent. The other types besides translucent panels that can be used are monofacial, where you have the panel over the crops at a tilt, and largely on top of the agricultural production. Or you can have it monofacial, where let's just say that it's standing vertical. So the bifacial. So there's solar generation from both sides of the panels. And then there's also there's so many different designs and customizations for farms to elevate the panels lower or higher as is needed per farm. So this is not just a one type of design. Every design is going to be unique and specific for every plot, even if a farmer has quite a few plots on their farm production. So advantages for agrivoltaics in the terms of plants and livestock. You can conserve the input costs. For water, of course, you can increase the efficiency and the conservation of the water, but you can also lower, or the farmers, if they're using municipal water, which a lot often do if they do not have agricultural wells, is to lower their municipal water bills, which is always going to be very expensive and more expensive in some other parts in California. For land regeneration, there's improvement of the soil health. You can preserve the water table and the soil microbiology because we do need, or the soil does need, the beneficial microorganisms of bacteria and fungus to the plants uptake minerals and nutrients in the soil. And we want to save the topsoil. There is a 60% topsoil that's been estimated that's left that we're trying to preserve across the world. And agrivoltaics has the potential to work with conserving that topsoil. For energy, it can be now stored. So long ago, you'd have to sell your energy back to the grid or back to the electricity company for credits. But now you can store it in batteries and use immediately. You can also sell and donate it to local communities. But it will also help to offset the cost for electricity use. So what I was going to share about the electricity use here is that in my experience working with small scale farms is that when they have to pump the water from the agricultural wells, it's going to cost because of the electricity needed in order to pump that water. During the extreme heat weather, I have heard of having to pump the water 3 up to 4 times a day just to make sure that the water does not become severely dehydrated and impacted, and then loss of their growth. So there had been small scale farmers that were reporting that a few years ago it was maybe $180 a month during the summer to follow this this need of the water for the extreme heat. And I think it was 2022, there was farmers that were complaining that it went up to $300 and then at times from $300 to $900 in just 1 month's time. So they were losing their shirts and they were ready to hang up their hats. And it all really had to do with not just the inputs from the plants and the cost of the water, but the cost of the electricity bill, which was an outlier. And so another potential advantage that agrivoltaics can serve is for a community. You can share the energy, or the farmers can share the energy locally, and they can also help to ensure a lot happier labor force that either comes through seasonally or they're year round. So you can help to mitigate any kind of health and heat stress injuries. And also this can build more jobs, not just in the farming industry, but other industries, say like solar energy and green technology. So what's happening? Where is this happening? First of all, in 1981, there were 2 German physicists that brought this, that they published and conceptualized the idea of using 2 things at once, which is the photovoltaics and land. And so it wasn't until 2004 that there was a prefecture in Japan that realized that this was going to be highly advantageous for their islands, since their land efficiency had to be used at its maximum to scale up and not wide. And so what was found in Japan after 2004 is that there was an increase of 76% of their renewable energy, and now they have a countrywide support. In 2011 in France, there was looked at the tilt of the panels, the bifacial panels, so it can be used for vertical use. They looked at the radiation stress and thermal stress on both the ambient temperature and the plant and the soil temperature. And they found that this data was very helpful to help mitigate climate change. And also in France, the researcher was the first to coin the term agrivoltaics instead of continuing to use many different words to explain what this system is. I've heard of agrisolar, I've heard of dual use, I've heard of agrophotovoltaics, but it was in France in 2011 that their publication coined the term agrivoltaics. And this research was to other countries supporting using agrivoltaics. So fast forward to September of this year in 2024, in northern Italy, there's a winery that used 7,700 panels, or as now they're called arrays, to work with their winery. What they had found was that they received between 20 and 60% yield increase. They were able to, or the panels were able to cut down on the wind, which was a factor that could be detrimental to their harvest. They also found that the harvest had an ideal sugar content and ideal pH. So this is what's happening around the world, but what's happening in the United States? There is a wonderful interactive map. It's by a program called Inspire that's from the US Department of Energy. And this interactive map is really cool, where you can look at the different agrivoltaic activities, if it's crop, habitat like pollinators, grazing. What kind of grazing? Is it sheep? Is it goat? Is it cow? And then there's greenhouse. The different kinds of photovoltaic technologies. So you can pick and choose what you're looking for, and you can see what is currently happening in the United States. It would be cool if they had this around the world, but I have not found an interactive map for that just yet. There's also on this website, there is a page, there's a data portal, so you can see currently and previously what kind of studies have been conducted and published. And there's also a financial page to see what kind of input financially and revenue that can potentially happen for a certain location and reason. So you can also look at what's active research currently versus commercial growing. So in the United States, we do have the research side, we have the commercial side. There's some great studies coming out of Arizona, Oregon, New Jersey, here in California. I'm actually here at UC Davis right now for another agrivoltaics conference, and there's a lot of wonderful, wonderful data that's brought to the table. There's also the government that's working with research and for financial support. The Nature Conservancy in Colorado joins Jack's Solar Garden. And the cool thing about Jack's Solar Garden is that it is both research, but it also is partially commercial. For the commercial, there's slowly but surely, there's a lot of commercial growth with agrivoltaic system that's happening in the United States. One interesting project that's about to set in Madison County, Ohio, is they're looking to create an agrivoltaic system that's going to generate 800 megawatts of electricity, which is, I think, enough to feed something like 3 small cities for energy. And I think that is funded by the Bill Gates Foundation. So, and then here in Southern California, we at Pitzer, for the Robert Redford Conservancy, we are doing the first agrivoltaic study in Southern California. We're really excited that we'll be breaking ground very soon, and we're partnering with Cal Poly Pomona, and we'll be setting up the solar panels will be installed very soon at their Spadra farm, which is a research farm and also for commercial growth. We'll be looking at the growth of lettuce, romaine lettuce specifically, and we'll be looking at soil health and quality, temperature, water conservation, and plant phytonutrient. So more to come about that. How in the disaster, and to be prepared instead of a reactive, but a proactive source to help your local community. The first thing I would say is to talk about it. Use the word agrivoltaics, look it up, roll it on your tongue. Just please talk about it because it is something that's growing. It's a fantastic community that's just so really pumped with energy on the advantages that agrivoltaics can bring. You can also collaborate with agencies in your federal, your state, and your local agencies. There is a little shout out I wanted to do in this section here for the California Farm Link. I found this very interesting nonprofit, which it helps farmers with lending, land access, education. They have business courses and resources. I was at a workshop at the Eco Farm conference a few years ago where they gave this wonderful education to farmers on how to prepare your taxes, specifically with agriculture or laws or tax laws around agriculture and agriculture producers. And get familiar with your funding sources. I'm hoping that the momentum of support and funding is going to continue. So far, there is the Inspire program with the Department of Energy that one can look into. There's the REAP program with the USDA, and there's also the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a very helpful program to know where it creates 3 bonus credits that can increase the value of clean energy projects that's transferable to tax credits. So there's like the low income community that can receive a 10% bonus, energy community 10% bonus, but there's also possible to get up to 60% in tax credits for projects that meet all their categories. So we have physically what we have at an agrivoltaic site is that there's going to be shelter. There is most likely the panels would be over the agricultural production at a tilt, but it still would be some kind of shelter for any kind of natural disaster. There's also going to be stored energy that, of course, these agrivoltaics systems would have batteries in place. These are typically going to be in a rural or peri-rural area, so you're not close to buildings per se, if that is going to be something that would be dangerous. And I would be absolutely remiss to not share with you something fantastic that I think that every agrivoltaics system should at least look into, if not actually have. It's called the PNK kit, which the PNK stands for the Personal Network. Organization in Brooklyn, New York. They're called Community Tech New York, and I had the opportunity to go to Brooklyn and learn with 2 other colleagues from Pitzer about building a portable network kit. So it's basically a kit that's housed in, it looks like a carry-on case that you can take on a plane. In fact, we did when we brought it back from Brooklyn to California, and it can be governed more equitably. It consists of the off-the-shelf hardware, open source software, and it is created by the Community Tech group. And it is it's a learning tool for community members. They can be trained on this because you don't purchase this, you build it. And once you build it, you can go back to your community and with all kinds of groups, be it education, a church, other organizations, your local municipality, you can teach how to build this. And it can be used not just for in the moment of disaster, if there's no electricity, and let's say the Wi-Fi is down, that in a certain space, like say 800 feet to a mile, that people can text each other, and then it can also be connected to a local Wi-Fi that can bring it to this kit. And so people in the community, let's just say you go to this area and you can find a independent Wi-Fi station. So the kit on the left, the box on the left, that's yellow, that is the actual kit. Like I said, it's the size of a carry-on. And then up top in the clear box, that is the training kit. Because again, you don't purchase these, you build them. In conclusion, I'd like to thank you so much for your time and learning about agrivoltaics. I think it's a great opportunity, and it would be great advantages to your local communities and your municipalities. I thank you, and please practice using the word agrivoltaics. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rose, so much for giving that awesome presentation. I see my colleague Catherine put in the chat, but just once again, if you guys have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to drop them in the chat for a live Q&A. And now we will start transitioning to Dr. Rachel's presentation.
Sure. Should I take it away?
Go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us. And thank you to Rose for that really interesting presentation. I definitely learned a bunch. And I promise I will practice using that word out and about. So as Daniela so graciously introduced me, my name is Rachel Schattman. I'm an assistant professor of sustainable agriculture at the University of Maine. I'm also a retired vegetable farmer. And I wanted to start with land acknowledgement as well. The University of Maine is located on Marsh Island, which is the homeland of the Penobscot Nation. The Penobscot homeland is connected to other Wabanaki tribal nations, including the Passamaquoddy, the Maliseet, and the Micmac, through kinship alliances and diplomacy. Our group, the Agroecology Lab at the University of Maine, acknowledges that naming this historical relationship between the University of Maine and those tribal communities who call Marsh Island home is not enough, and that as a land-grant university, we are partial to inexcusable injustices that have been experienced both by tribal communities in Maine and those who had land taken from them to raise funds for moral act endowments. So we commit to interrogating our positions of power and privilege and going beyond land acknowledgements in our work to envision a more just future. With that, I am excited to share with you this presentation about part of how we try to get resources to farmers and agricultural advisors to help them deal with climate change as best they can. Can everyone see my screen? Can I get a thumbs up from somebody with a thank you very much? I appreciate that, Kyle. All right, so the tool I'm going to share with you today is something that has been developed in the context of a program that I run with many other wonderful collaborators called the Climate Adaptation and Mitigation Fellowship. You can see all of the logos of our many partners down there on the left. Some of the specific co-authors for the tool I'm going to share include Jason Lilly, who is a sustainable agriculture specialist at the University of Maine Extension, Sarah Kellerman, who was recently with the Northeast Climate Hub, but now is with American Farmland Trust. I see people from Climate Hubs and the American Farmland Trust on the call. And Erin Lane, who is with the Northeast Climate Hub. So lots of co-authors and brilliant minds at the table. In my short 20-minute talk today, I'm not going to belabor the effects of climate change, but I do know that many of you on the call don't necessarily work in agriculture as part of your day-to-day. So I am going to highlight just some key points about how agriculture is affecting those who live and manage the land. And then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of how this tool helps people deal with climate change in their operations. First of all, we all know increasing temperatures are happening across the globe. I just heard on the radio this morning that this year is expected to again break the record for warmest year on record. That doesn't look the same in every place around the country, however. So I think it's important to recognize that there's geographic variation and there's also seasonal variation. In many places, we expect that temperatures will deviate from normal more dramatically in winter months. And this has consequences for all sorts of ecosystem factors, such as insect survivorship, and on crops that require cold periods to vernalize. We are seeing this manifested both in an extended growing season. So the growing season is defined as that period of time between killing frost. And that also translates into shifts in plant hardiness zones. Some of you might have seen that in the past year or so, the USDA has released a revised plant hardiness zone map. Basically, what this map details and what this kind of concept details is the places where different groups of plants, perennials, annuals, crops, whatever, can survive based on the coldest temperature that it gets to. So it makes sense that as coldest temperatures increase, that more plants would be able to survive in these regions. In general, most parts of the United States experience a bump of half a zone, which is quite significant in the last 30 years. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. Obviously, an extended growing season is not a bad thing for many growers. There's a lot more opportunity for successional planting if you're growing annuals. There are more growing degree days, which means that many crops develop faster. And there's the potential to grow more in different crops. So a lot of folks in the Northeast where I am are really excited about peaches. We've never been able to grow peaches in Maine before, but we've had a couple of good peach crop years, and that's nothing to sneeze at. But it gets complicated because it's not just about the temperature, it's about the variability of that temperature and the amount of risk that you are willing to take with things, with having an early frost, for example. We also know that climate change and warmer atmosphere means that more water can be held in that atmosphere. Rain events are happening in more concentrated periods. Rainfalls are heavier, raindrops are heavier. Atmospheric rivers are changing and weather patterns are holding more stationary in a lot of parts of the country, which means that you can get a rainstorm that just sits over your region for weeks now instead of days. It also means that there's, at least in many parts of the country and many parts of the world, a greater likelihood that you will have longer extended dry periods. So even though some parts of the world are expecting an increase in precipitation over an annual period, the times of the year when that precipitation arrives is not necessarily always conducive to agricultural needs. This is a map that kind of breaks out the parts of the countries, this map here on the right, that breaks out the parts of the countries that are expecting to see an increase in precip and versus those that are expecting to see a decrease in precip. We all have our particular challenges. And I think that is kind of the premise of the planning work that I do is understanding that everybody's situation is unique. Something that is very widely discussed in agricultural conversations about climate change is the effect of climate change on the soil. So with these heavier rainstorms that we are experiencing and that we expect to experience in the future, one of the biggest impacts is that we are losing soil. There have been some studies shown that it's not a linear relationship, that we expect to lose more soil for every inch of annual rainfall that comes down. But other things that are also concerning include compaction, which is a result of driving heavy equipment on wet soil, erosion, and loss of seeds or fertilizer or ag chemicals and nutrient runoff. So basically, when you get a heavy rainstorm, there's a high likelihood that if you have put down fertilizer, that fertilizer is going to wash away either through surface runoff or through percolation. Likewise, heavy rainstorms can kind of wash away seed beds. And that has both implications for farm businesses, but also for the greater ecosystem and public health. Because this is a short presentation, I'm not going to open it up at this point for people to speak, but if you want to use the chat, I'd like to hear from you all and read your thoughts on planning processes. So these are all the things, this is the climate change is the context in which we are making decisions, our municipalities are making decisions, our organizations are making decisions, and in the case of my work, farms are making decisions. We all have to do some degree of planning just as a matter of course. So even if you haven't done climate planning, what are some characteristics that you can think of that make for a good planning process in general? And how do you know it's good? How do you know you've succeeded? If you are an experienced planner, maybe you can stick in the chat some ideas about what are the major milestones that you look for in a planning process that you use as a benchmark. So just take a second to look at those questions. I can't see the chat as I go along, but I will come back to them after I stop sharing my screen, I promise. All right, let's talk about the camp planning process. So this is a cyclical process because, in my opinion, it's never done. You figure out the context of your environment and what you're trying to do. You identify some options, you assess those options, you put them into practice, you monitor and assess, you share what you learn, and then you revise and you start the process all over again. So we're going to take this step by step around the circle. So let's start with risk assessment. In the context of agriculture, what we're looking at are, for every farm or for every business, a pretty discrete set of risks. What we try to do is encourage people to take it from these very general risks, like we get an early or a late frost and it totally wipes out my, let's say we get a late frost and it wipes out my apple crop because the apples have already flowered, and then the late frost kills the blooms and then you don't get any apples. Rather than kind of keeping it general, we ask people to make it very specific. So what part of the farm experiences the most noticeably? Is it happening at this farm that's kind of on the north slope, or is it happening to the neighbor that's over there on the south slope? So trying to get people to be as careful and targeted with their risk identification as they can. I think one of the things that's challenging for us as people is that as humans, we're really well wired to make decisions based on what's really up close to us. So you've heard I guess it's an idiom, you can't see the forest for the trees. We're really good at looking at trees. We're really bad at looking at the forest. If something is far away from us in time or in our personal experience or geographically, it becomes kind of fuzzy in our decision making. So the challenge in this risk identification process is being able to see those things that are up close to us, but also see those things that are a little bit further away. How this looks like in the planning tool, which for those of you who are part of the breakout session that I'm leading, we're going to go through this together, is we ask people to kind of do this for a particular farm or a particular business. And we have them identify what their climate risk factors are that they're most concerned about. And there's kind of, we call it a risk factor bank up here that gives some examples, but it's certainly not intended to be limiting. To be very clear and specific about what the concerns are and what they mean for the farm business. And then to take a step back and think about if there are any benefits, right? So there's some good research in social psychology about leading with strength when you're problem solving. And I think it's helpful to remember at the beginning of this type of planning process, what resources you already have at your disposal and what's already going really well. So that's what column D and E are about. And then after you've filled out this sheet, what we ask people to do is to rank things. And the reasoning behind this is that climate impacts can be so tremendously overwhelming, right? Like there's just so much coming at us and we're getting pulled in so many different directions. But it can be helpful to force ourselves to say, actually, because I can't address everything at once, I'm going to prioritize this one or that one. So we ask people to rank their concerns. Before we get to the implementation or to the option identification piece, something that I wanted to just drive home once again is the importance of how specific everybody's situation is. My team tells me that I need to take this slide out because it has too much math, but I really believe in it. I think it's a good one. So this equation, basically what it says is that vulnerability, V, is a function, that's what the little X means, of somebody's exposure to a given risk. So we've already identified the risks we're most concerned about. So our exposure to that risk and our adaptive capacity. So how equipped are we to respond to that risk? How much money do we have to spend on it? How many people do we have to address it? What is our land base? What is our community support? All of the things that kind of contribute to our ability to respond. And then the subscript, SILT, stands for in a given system or on a farm, to a given climate stimulus, in a given location, and over a given period of time. So all of this is just a really fancy math way of saying that what works for one farm, for one business, for one town is not necessarily going to work for another. So as people kind of consider what their vulnerability is, we ask them to think about things like farm location, microclimate, the different requirements of the crops they grow, the livestock they raise, and the time period in which they're vulnerable. I have a colleague at Rutgers who is very fond of saying that it's never about whether or not you lose something to a climate disaster in 1 year. It's about how many years in a row or how many years out of 10 you can really sustain losses. So the time period is really important. I'm going to start moving faster so I make it through my my time check here. The next stage of the planning process is identifying the options. So I use kind of a mythical farm here to illustrate this process. And this mythical farm, it's a very sandy soil. They run a CSA that's pretty big, it's got 450 members, and they are mostly drawing water for irrigation out of a river. So they use a power takeoff pump. For those of you who don't know, it connects to a tractor. The tractor turns on and spins the gears, and then it rotates and powers the pump. And that's how people kind of withdraw water from a surface body and send it out through an irrigation system. So they are most concerned about dry periods and drought and being able to germinate seeds on their sandy soil. Sandy soil is very well drained, so you have to water frequently. The thing that they have to consider, and the thing that I ask people to consider when we go through this planning process with them, is to put all of the options on the table. So often when we're thinking about problem solving, we kind of limit ourselves to what feels reasonable or possible. However, if you don't put everything out there, like the wildest and craziest ideas, then essentially what you do is you kind of rob yourself of your more creative options. Just putting something out there as an option doesn't mean that you're going to do it, but it does kind of force you to put some maybe more conflict laden or more disruptive options out there. So the one that often resonates with farmers or scares the pants off farmers is maybe you need to consider not being in business. There are lots of people who, you know, they reach a threshold and they can't keep going. I'm not saying that through this planning process, I want people to decide to stop farming, but sometimes it's a necessary choice. So just kind of putting those goalposts out there and then giving yourself the full range of opportunity. So again, this spreadsheet tool that we've developed, the pages are hyperlinked to each other. So based on what was identified as a climate risk in previous pages, it'll auto-populate here. Your most important one or the highest ranked one will come up to the top. And then this is where you brainstorm, your list of adaptation strategies and make any notes about them that would be helpful. Obviously, every strategy has trade-offs. There's not going to be any single silver bullet. So what I try to encourage people to do next is think about the trade-offs that they're making. This is called an Eisenhower square. And what it allows you to do is identify 2 axes along which you might evaluate different options, and then plot your options based on those axes. So to go back to our Sandy Beach farm, they could either keep their irrigation system running until it died. That would be both easy and inexpensive. They could transition to dry land farming, which would be inexpensive and very difficult. They could upgrade their PTO pump, which would be easy and a little bit more expensive, or they could install electricity to a permanent pump, which would be difficult and more disruptive, having to dig lines and things like that, and also expensive. But you can see that's like one way to articulate trade-off. Expense and ease might not be the things that matter to people, though. So you can put anything on these axes. You could put risk, greenhouse gas emissions. You can see how you can place different options in different quadrants based on where they fall. And I think it's something to consider, like what would go on your axes. So if you are making a plan, or if you're working with stakeholders who are making a plan, what are those things that they really care about that need to be plotted and thought about? If just 2 axes is just not enough for you, that's fine. We make decisions based on multiple criteria all the time. This is a little bit less polished, but what it represents is the different criteria that you might use in evaluating different options. And then you kind of assign arbitrary scores. They're not based on hard data. They're based on kind of your gut understanding of a system. What this looks like is, I would recommend like a -10 to a +10 scale. And just based on your best understanding, assigning a score to each option based on these common criteria, which allow you ultimately to come up with a final score and kind of compare different options against each other. I also get teased for liking spreadsheets way too much. So I hear this is not your preferred way of learning. There's other options. The reality is even if we're not making decisions about climate adaptation and mitigation strategies based on cost, that cost is a factor, and it's just a reality for a lot of people. So what we then support people to do is to use what's called a partial budget. And I apologize, I'm gonna breeze past this slide to go to this example. What a partial budget does really well is it allows us to articulate, if we're moving from practice A to practice B, or system A to system B, what are the increases in income that we expect? What are the decreases in income? What are the increases in cost or the decreases in cost? And then what is the actual change in net income that we expect, which allows us to understand if this adaptation is actually going to be a financial cost or benefit to us. So this is also included in the tool that I'm going to share with you after the presentation. But it's articulated in such a way that I hope people don't feel constrained by the financial analysis. There's also places to articulate the ecological benefits of the strategy, the social and community benefits, and likewise the costs in each of those 2 categories. Once people have gone through this level of assessment, it's time to re-rank and again prioritize, because there are going to be some things that are, low-hanging fruit that you can get to right away and that don't cost a lot of money and can be easy to implement. And there are going to be things that are aspirational and will require a lot more support. So helping people to kind of re-rank what they're expecting. I am up on my time, so I am going to say that there's more to this process. I'm always in favor of encouraging people to think about like how they know when they've succeeded, how they know when they've won. And that's what monitoring and assessment is about. And that we can talk more about it in the breakout sessions if you all decide that that's of interest to you. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Daniela.
Okay, thank you, Rachel, so much for that great presentation on a planning tool that I hope is really useful for our participants. So we are going to transition into the Q&A session. And so if you have any questions for either speaker, please drop them into the chat and we will ask our speakers for them. And I will start off with a question for Rose. And so what do you think are the main reasons agrivoltaics has not been more widely adopted? Are there specific challenges or uncertainties that may deter its use?
Hi. So I would say that the key, there's probably a few reasons why it hasn't moved forward more rapidly. And I think, especially in California, if not in the rest of the United States, is getting the political socio shift towards the support. There's a lot of people, that's why I'm saying, let's get the word out, let's talk about it some more, because to get the word out in the mainstream, then people are not going to be so people may tend to be less cautious and a little bit more interested, ask more questions about agrivoltaics. I do know that there's just a lot of regulation in the state of California. If you're not from California, there's just everything has to be scrutinized and approved. And that takes a long time. And even before it's scrutinized and approved, there's got to be something that's put on in a meeting or on a bill or, you know, some kind of recognition and support. And then after that comes funding. This is not going to be a transition that can be easily moved for any kind of farmer, even if it's someone that has, say, a lot of, huge amount of revenue and capital that they can tap into. So this is the endeavor here to be at this conference is to learn how to go from a niche system to a commercial scale system and a lot more adopted, not just in the state of California, but nationwide as well. So I would say it's the legislative support, it's your local municipality support. Some municipalities have a lot less hoops to jump through, but it's because a lot of them have not really heard enough about agrivoltaics, if at all. So I hope that's answered the question.
Thank you. And for Dr. Rachel, so how have farmers in your fellowship program responded to the adoption of more adaptive yet costly risk reduction strategies? And what factors have influenced their decision making? And how do they perceive the long-term value of these investments?
That's a really great question. Well, I will say that in our program, we don't require people to actually make the changes. So it's a planning support program, but because we don't have funds to support the implementation, it's not something that we would ever say, you have to do this. That being said, I've been surprised by the number of people who have come through the program who were already thinking about an adaptation strategy, and then this program kind of just helped push them that last little step. And we've had folks doing really, really creative stuff, from fabricating equipment to trying new planting strategies, new mulching strategies. Obviously, we work in the Northeast, which is a temperate region. So the examples I give are related to agriculture in this region. So people are willing to take some financial risk, I guess, is my takeaway from that. And a lot of that is because I think they perceive the near term and the long term benefit to doing so. We're also at this period in time where there's been a tremendous amount of funding made available to the agricultural community for climate change mitigation practices, which are not necessarily synonymous with adaptation practices, but for some there's overlap. And with Inflation Reduction Act funds coming through agencies like the Natural Resources Conservation Service, there's just been kind of a tremendous bump in what's available. So some people have really jumped on that opportunity to do things and get some financial support to implement some things that maybe they wouldn't have been able to afford otherwise, or they wouldn't have been able to afford as soon. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that response. And we'll jump it back to Rose. So one of the questions, what is the upfront cost of implementing agrivoltaic systems on small scale farms? And are there ways that small scale farms can be supported to make this technology more accessible?
I do not have a figure, just because the research that we're currently about to embark on is done through a grant and through the collaboration with Cal Poly Pomona, which is a state university. I do know that it's not going to be cheap, especially now since solar energy it's still, getting its feet off the ground, really, especially in California, which is ironic. But my hope is that when you have the case studies, when you have the data, when you have publications, or you can see farmers or others in, say, your local municipality in the government, in research, in local organizations and agencies, they can come and see an actual standing agrivoltaic system, then it is that experience of observation and seeing what's happened season after season to show that there are advantages, and it's not just a few. It's just like an onion; it just keeps layer. There's just so many layers to unfold and look for the advantages. So the solar panels, I've heard of solar panel companies where they I think I've heard it mostly on the East Coast, and it's starting to move westward, where a solar panel company may ask a farm if they could rent their space where they put the panels over their crops, so the farmer actually gains something by having this done by the solar panel company. They are actually also paid for the solar panel to have the solar panel company. They're the ones that once they generate the energy and store it, that they use it for whatever their purposes are. So I've heard of quite a few different unique attempts to get this actually on the ground for farmers. For a small scale farm, I heard that I've been in discussion with, how soon can a small scale farmer achieve this transition? And what I've been in a conversation with the solar panel company, Grid Alternatives in Southern California. They were talking about to do case studies where you started off, or I'm sorry, not a case study, to start off with the commercial growers that will most likely have, say, investors, and they can approach and take or use the opportunity of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is to help their tax credits. So that could be the start, and hopefully soon after that, the small scale farms will be following. It is the elephant in the room for me that yes, this is a great idea, but let's be real. We got to talk about how much it costs and how soon someone can have this transition over for them. So that's as far as I know. I wish I had a number. However, please keep in mind that an agrivoltaic system is going to be very unique to every single farm. It can be done on a small scale on a farm. So you can have agrivoltaics in a section or, very sporadic. So it could be a small, or it can be, like the whole farm, like I showed you in the picture of the Northern Italian vineyard. But I know that there is some information out there, and I didn't put it into my slides, about potential costs for agrivoltaics. However, again, keep in mind how different the prices will be between, like, say, California and a different state.
Yes, thank you for that input. I think that's a really good consideration and answer. And I will just jump to one question for Rachel before we break out into our interactive session. But considering that climate adaptation strategies, specifically from the agricultural sector, are more unfamiliar to some, how do you encourage practitioners to determine which strategies would be most effective based on their work?
That's an interesting question. I think actually one of the things that's more common for us to run into is people who say, well, there's a big overlap between conservation practices, which have been around for a long time and supported by the USDA and soil and water conservation groups for decades. There's an overlap between those practices and the things that a lot of people are using to do something like protect their soil structure. So practices like cover crops or reduced tillage or buffer planting. So it's more than introducing new practices to people. I would say that it's about encouraging people to reframe how they think of the trade-offs associated with those practices. And what role those practices might play in making their individual farm business more resistant and resilient to climate change.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just say we will be sending out the recording soon if you want to review any of the presentations. And for the people who also did not get to come to the live session, they'll be able to see that. And then just plugging the rest of the series. So if you stay up to date on our website. You'll learn more about future sessions that we'll be having, that we'll be sending through our mailing list. And that concludes our session. So thank you guys so much.